Well, hello, everyone. I'm Tzvi Bodie, and this is the 25th episode of Ideas and Lives, a program in which we interview people we know who have interesting ideas, in our opinion, and fascinating lives. And I am joined because today I'm interviewing my co-host, Bob Lerman. We have invited Tamar Jacoby, who herself was one of our first interviewees and knows Bob. She's a colleague of him in his endeavors to sell the idea of apprenticeship. So, Tamar, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Tzvi, and hello, listeners. I'm Tamar Jacoby, and as advertised, I'm both a substitute teacher today. I'm substituting for Bob, and who would normally be in the questioning chair, and I'm a colleague of Bob's, and I work with him. I run a policy shop here in DC, and I work with him to promote apprenticeship, and I'm looking forward to grilling him.
All right. Well, this is, yes, grill. That's the operative word. So, Bob, first question. You are one of how many children? And once you give your answer, please tell us what influence you think the size of your family had on you.
Well, I'm one of 10 children. 9 are boys, and the influence was many. One was we had a very strong sports culture in the family. We were all active in one sport or another. So that
should be said that you grew up in South Bend, Indiana.
I grew up in South Bend, Indiana.
And what was your sport?
Where there was room for a family of 10 relatively easily. Our sports were everything.
You had a sport?
Well,
my main sport, surprised.
My main sport was wrestling. Basketball, I really wasn't at 5'2". I wasn't really equipped to do too well there. There are a few that were, but I wasn't that talented. So I was a wrestler, but we all played all the sports: baseball, football. We tried to mess around with basketball, and
ice hockey.
Now ice hockey became a big thing. That was mostly after I left South Bend, but it wasn't just the number. I mean, one good thing about the number was that you can't spoil 10 children that easily. So I wasn't spoiled. You learn to do a lot of things for yourself. And because of the 10, of course, I'm number 4. So we didn't always have 10. But because of so many children in the family, I could sort of sneak out and do things that maybe, my parents weren't too keen on, but nothing terrible, but it allowed that. But in addition, I got a lot of influence from older brothers, and my sister is younger, so all of the people above me were brothers. And one in particular, Jerry Lerman, who is one older than me, he was number 3. He went to the University of Chicago as an undergraduate, and that was a big influence. He also, I think, a lot of ways in a big family, sometimes the older people set the trend for the next few. So they were good students, the people, my brother is above me. My brother Jerry was the first one to join the debate team. So in high school, I was on the debate team. Of course, baseball and the rest of the sports. But
you didn't go to the University of Chicago.
I didn't go to the University of Chicago.
Wait, let's not get there yet. It's not time for
All right.
Yeah. So let's talk about so you grew up in an observant Jewish home, correct? What influence did that have? How
Well,
observant and what influence?
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, that was a huge influence. I would say we would go to the Orthodox synagogue in town. My dad was very active, in fact, helped create a new small one in our neighborhood. But we weren't totally observant. And we might walk to the synagogue on Saturday morning and go off to a Notre Dame football game in the afternoon. So now, since then, the family became far more observant, and the whole.
Well, I'm interested in the effect
family.
on you. The effect on you. Like, how did you come
Well,
away
I
need to
felt,
rebel
yeah,
against
I
that?
felt
or
very
adopting that?
Jewish oriented, and one of the effects it had was, I mean, I didn't think about it too much in high school. I mean, other than the fact that, you know, we had to be out of school certain days that other people weren't. You know, we just, you know, we observed, and, you know, we felt a connection, close connection. And,
No anti-Semitism in South Bend, or none affected?
barely. You know, I had a couple of incidents of people saying something, but not in any serious way.
What
Even
years are
though
we
we're
talking about? When were you a teenager? What decade?
the late 50s,
Right.
early 60s.
Yeah.
I graduated high school in 61.
Yeah.
And yeah, there wasn't much. But one thing was the case was that, you know, I felt very much as a minority. And
Did. Mm.
it was, so in terms of dating, that was, so if you wanted to date a Jewish girl, you know, there weren't as many around.
You had to go to Chicago. Huh?
Bob once told me he went to Israel because that's where the Jewish girls
Well,
were.
eventually.
And that's who he married. Yes.
Yeah, eventually. But then, because, you know, it kind of had an influence on where I went to college, which was Brandeis. And the whole thing with my brother Jerry going to Chicago was he brought back these big books on Western civilization, other things. I thought that was very interesting. In high school, I was not like you, Tzvi. I didn't love the classes. I liked some were very boring, but I did other things. I was a co-editor of the high school paper. I was on the debate team. So we even had a radio program. So we did different things, and in sports. And I barely read a book I didn't have to read for school. I just wasn't. I mean, I always viewed my brother Jerry, who's went to University of Chicago, as kind of the intellectual in the family. He had been widely read. He remembered everything. And I really kind of got an inkling that I might like the world of ideas from what he would bring home and my discussions with
Now, are
him.
you're the only
Wait, we have to
one
say,
of-
let me just
Yeah,
comment
go
on
ahead.
one thing, time out, because you can't see listeners can't see what's behind Bob, which is a solid wall of books. So Bob is sitting there saying, like, I never read a book, in front of a solid wall of a lifetime.
Yeah, Bob is a true intellectual thought leader. So, and I'm wondering, are you the only one of the 10 who became an academic?
Yeah, for a career. My brother Don did for a short time, but yeah, as a career.
So the one thing we didn't talk about your childhood was the other sort of big pillar, in my view, is your strong father. You had a father who was,
Yeah,
my
that was
a
yeah,
very dynamic, influential
my
person.
father was very influential. And we had a culture of working hard, of being an underdog, especially in sports, and he was an underdog, and he was an amazing man. We all feel, all 10 of us, that he did so much in his
Well, he founded a family business.
62 years. Well, he founded several businesses. Some didn't work out, but he kept at it. And we just saw the way he dealt with people also in the business. It was a small business, but partly in manufacturing and what we would call the shop, going out to the shop. The shop was the shop floor where the machines were and where you cut the steel. It was a steel service business. He knew everybody. Everybody admired him. They thought of him as almost a father figure. These are the employees. And I remember vividly when somebody got in jail, they called him to help bail him out. When a woman had a domestic violence situation, she called him to deal with it. He on Thanksgiving, he would buy a bunch of turkeys and he would hand out each employee. He would hand out this big, beautiful turkey before Thanksgiving. So this is the kind of person he was, and it penetrated the rest of us. He was also very, how can I say it? He wasn't shy, and he knew who he was, and he just as he was very comfortable with the regular workers, he was comfortable with a senator or with anyone. And so I'm not saying I was quite able to mimic that, but he was certainly an inspiration.
Great. Okay, fast forward to college.
And by the way, as I go into college, I want to mention my father as well, because in college, even at that time, especially at Brandeis, which was a pretty liberal school, and there would be people who were sort of skeptical of business and so on, and people sort of claiming, well, business discriminates and it does this and it does this badly. And of course, I knew my father, and I knew my father's example. And so I also knew inherently, as even I started studying economics, I immediately saw how competition was playing a huge role in the way the business operated. Most people, when they start college, they've been in a family, they might have worked a little bit, but they don't really have any experience with, quote, the economy. And that influence of the business and my father in it, and trying to do the right thing and having difficult challenges in doing so, played a big role in my defending free markets and defending business, even as early as college.
It should be said that the business is quite healthy today. It's a family-owned, family-run business. Many of your siblings are involved in it. So
yeah, they built it up dramatically. My father would be shocked at the size, but getting back to Brandeis.
So let me ask a question about Brandeis. So there you are, sort of from the real world, relatively small Midwestern city. I won't say working class. Your dad was the manager, but still working class milieu. Yeah. Suddenly at Brandeis, was that
right? I'm with all these New Yorkers, and people from wealthy suburbs of Cleveland and Pittsburgh, and people who went to far better high schools than I did.
So what people he did was he wrestled with them.
Much better vocabularies. And my freshman year, in the dorm. These people had all, they've gotten in, they had to work very hard to get into Brandeis. I didn't have to work that hard, but anyway, and I was, as I say, far less well-read. And so they would play bridge and I would do homework because I had already, when I was in high school, I messed around a lot. We had bridge, but we had a bit of drinking. Anyway, this was the first time away. And I was in a way able to be away because I was in this big family. So I had already had my, oats run a little bit, and I was ready to learn. And there were some teachers that were so stimulating that and the kind of books that we were reading was so different from high school. I mean, just the level of learning from high school to college was like a felt, And so I found myself being fairly good at economics. I did like politics and political science, but my brother Jerry, again, an influence, and I asked him, I'm thinking about majoring either in economics or political science. He said, major in economics. He was in political science because you really need a teacher for that. In political science, you can read the books and, it helps to have a teacher, but in economics, you absolutely need the teaching. And so he helped me make what was a good choice for me. And I did well in that subject and ended up doing well at the university.
Do you keep in touch with any of your professors of economics from Brandeis?
No, I did actually. I had one professor a young professor who came either my junior year or senior year, I think. And I took some courses with him, and he was my honors thesis advisor. And I did keep in good touch with him. Sadly, he passed away about 10, 12 years ago, but he was later at Brookings, and we were in touch. But
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, so college.
Wait a minute. I forgot. The other Brandeis teacher played a huge role in my career, and her name was Barbara Bergman. Her maiden name was Barbara Berman, and she married Bergman. Anyway, I had her for some courses and did well in them, and I kept kind of in touch with her. She moved down to the University of Maryland, and so when I worked in Washington, I kept in touch with her, and she played a huge role in my becoming a professor at American University. We can talk about that now or later. But
well, I want to ask you, but I already forgot what I was going to ask you. Oh yeah, so you're arriving at Brandeis in what, 1962, and country's changing, right?
Fall of 61, yeah.
Fall of 61, and you're there fall of 61 through whatever
65, yeah.
So it's not yet 68, but America is undergoing a lot of turmoil. What did the 60s mean to you? Where were you in the 60s?
Great
well,
question.
I would say, I was, because after I went to Brandeis, I went directly to graduate school. So I was in the Boston area almost the entire period of the 60s, except for summers. By the time I graduated, there was the biggest thing going on was the free speech movement at Berkeley. Vietnam really hadn't gotten going yet in any serious way. There was also the civil rights movement, and a number of people at Brandeis were active in that and went down to that. And of course, I was very sympathetic to it.
Cheney, what's his name in Cheney? They were from Brandeis, weren't they? Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, one of them might have been. Anyway, So I was certainly caught up in the fight for civil rights. When I was in high school, I learned saxophone and became a jazz aficionado and played some jazz, but mostly rhythm and blues when I was younger, because to play a real good jazz saxophone, you have to have a lot of chops, as they say. You have to really have the great technique that good jazz players have. And I was able to ad lib. That was a fun thing in high school and in college, to learn to ad lib on all kinds of tunes, understand chord changes. So I was very into that. In fact,
Does that continue to this day?
Well, wait, don't, because I want to come back. I want to tie up the politics because you're veering away from politics.
So in other words, I was, and one thing is, I happen to know, both through working in my dad's business in the summers in the plant with a lot of Black workers, and being a musician, where in one group I was the only white guy in the group, and played some jobs where I was only the white guy in the hall. I was very oriented toward the need to improve the treatment of African Americans. At that time, they were called Negroes, actually. But and my father also, I think my father had I was proud of him for, he had a number of Black supervisors of white people in the 50s. And these were very good people. He always felt that people that were discriminated against, that sort of created an opportunity to get somebody who was better than who you could get who in the group that wasn't discriminated against. So I was very interested in that. I didn't really play that big a role in a formal way, but I was very sympathetic to it.
I mean, I would say about you now is that, you're sort of a man you're a man with vaguely left of center sympathies, but you're far from an ideologue, much less than many other people. And maybe there's something about being an economist that makes you less of an ideologue than other people. Or maybe it's something about, it sounds to me the way you describe your experience of the 60s, I've never heard this before, but like, you didn't really latch on to you cared about the civil rights aspect, but you didn't really latch on to the.
I basically felt that, in the late 60s, as these college protests were going on, that the administrators of colleges were weak and were unwilling to stand up for their own principles. And I still feel that way today. But I think even then, the whole thing started. And of course, the Vietnam War played a massive role in that. I always marvel at the fact that in that period, the polarization relating to race and the war were far more consequential in terms of people's lives than the disputes over critical race theory or things of that sort that have generated such polarization today.
Yeah. Okay, Sophie, it's your turn. I hogged the microphone for a while.
Yes. So let's talk about Israel, because at some point, I don't know whether it was when you were at Brandeis or when you graduated from Brandeis or when you finished your PhD at MIT, you went to Israel.
Well, before that. So Israel came about, but maybe I had to back up a little bit, because after graduate school, I taught in Pittsburgh for a couple of years and one of the city colleges for a semester. And then I got drawn. I was always interested in applying economics. I wasn't as interested in the theory. I mean, I thought it was interesting, but I wasn't going to be a big theorist. And it didn't grab me the way policy implications did. And so my dissertation was on youth unemployment. I had done a piece on Black-white earnings differences. And so when I got the opportunity to come to work for this Joint Economic Subcommittee on welfare programs, I grabbed it. And
What year was that?
that was in 1972.
And just to be clear to everyone, this is Congress.
The Congressional Joint Economic Committee, we had a subcommittee project on looking at all the welfare programs. And my boss has been interviewed on this series, Lair Townsend. And so I was working on this committee and enjoying it. And I was actually interesting part of the job there was looking at not only how the programs work together, but how we might improve the programs. What could we do? And at that time, the main thing that economists wanted was the negative income tax. And there was a lot of experiments and a lot of other things about it. And I was in favor of that. But I was assigned to look at a work-based alternative. And I came to, the more I worked on it, the more I believed in it, that was the way to go, especially with regard to what we would call intact families, two-parent families, or people that that could work without needing to have the childcare and everything.
So Bob, you're almost going to deprive me of the opportunity to tell the joke, which is that many people who know Bob and have known him for many years, long before apprenticeship was a topic in vogue in American political circles, the joke about Bob used to be, how long into the conversation can you go before he uses the word apprenticeship? And I'm noticing we're 33 minutes into this podcast, and the concept has only
Yeah, don't
Only
worry, we'll
come
get
up now. We didn't give him a chance.
We'll get there. We'll get there. But I believe that we could have a last resort employment program that could be effective. And I think had we had it in place during the 80s recessions, the early 80s, we would have saved a lot of.
So actually, tell the readers, tell the listeners what we mean. What's the last resort employment program?
Well, under the program that I devised called JOIN, the Jobs and Income Program, it was a combination of a job, and then if the job paid too little because of your family size, we would bump up the income through either child allowances or through a wage subsidy, a wage rate subsidy. Today we have the earned income tax credit,
sort of the EITC,
and that, yeah, and I think that played a big role. So what happened was, as that subcommittee was in place for a particular period of time, and I knew that the position would end with that. Meanwhile, a friend from college, Jack Habib, who's also been interviewed on the series, he came to Washington, and he met with that former professor that I said, Bob Hartman, who was at Brookings. And Hartman said, well, why don't you go see Bob Lerman? He's working on things similar to what you're working on in Israel. And so Jack Habib said, why don't you come to Israel? And I was thinking of going abroad for a year or something. And so he persuaded me, and I figured that's where the Jewish girls were. And I wasn't married at the time. So I took up the offer and spent 2 years in Israel. Second year after being married to Ariella, my wonderful wife, and worked on, and that's where I met Mayor Cohn, who worked with me. He was also interviewed in this series. And we published some articles together. And so that
We meaning Bob and Jack.
Jack, and also Mayor Jack and I published a piece. And then I got, while I was in Israel, I got an offer to come to the Institute for Research on Poverty. That was the first year that Ariel and I spent in the US. We were in Madison, Wisconsin. It happened to be the coldest winter. She hated it. And Jimmy Carter got elected on reforming welfare. Well, I just worked on reforming welfare. So, and at the Labor Department, a man was hired by the name of Arnold Packard, who was Assistant Secretary of Labor, and he and I both favored a more work-based reform of welfare rather than a pure cash system. And I started consulting with him and then got an offer to work at the Department of Labor in the Office of the Secretary on this welfare reform and subsequently on youth employment. From there, though, as that job was, I mean, I could have stayed there, but through the youth project, I got an offer to come back to Brandeis at the Heller School, where they had a big project on youth and government funding on youth. So we moved from Washington to Boston, and that's where we got to know you and Judy and became close friends. And while I was at Brandeis, I worked on both youth programs, and that's where also I got involved in thinking about, in terms of welfare, I was always thinking about the fact that single parenthood was a big element of American poverty. And people were studying the single parent families a lot, but I was asking, well, where are the fathers? Because at that time, you did need men to have a child. And so I started looking into that and seeing that, almost nothing was known about non-custodial fathers, as they're called, men who had fathered the children, but were no longer living with them. And so I decided to start looking at that, and especially in the context of youth. And so I ended up co-editing a book and writing several chapters in the book on young unwed fathers. And I got some funding from the Department of Health and Human Services to write on fatherhood and family structure. And so I was doing that. Meanwhile, I interacted with Shlomo Yitzhaki, who was a wonderful economist, an Israeli who was visiting at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And he was doing some interesting things on inequality. And we began to work together on income inequality in the US. And we developed together some interesting ways of decomposing inequality. Out of that, we published like 6 really good journal articles together. And that was very important for my next phase, which happened because I was working at the Heller School, but this was a soft money appointment, as they say, which is you're at an academic institution, but the funding for your salary comes through grants. So as long as you win those grants, you continue to stay there. Now, in my case, I also taught. I even supervised dissertations, but I didn't have a tenure or tenure track appointment at Brandeis. I really liked Brandeis, but that was the situation. So I was always open for other opportunities. And in 1989, late 88, I started looking a little more seriously for other positions, and some people were recommending different things. I came down to a conference in Washington, D.C., and I ran into my other influential economics professor, who sadly has also passed away, Barbara Bergman. And I ran into her at the airport, and she asked me, "How you doing, Bob?" And I said, "Okay." And she said, "Well, we're looking for a chairman. Why don't you apply?" This is at
This is
American University.
American. Yeah.
She had
American.
taken a position as a distinguished professor at American after being very distinguished at University of Maryland. Very well known, very well published economist. And I sort of did a double take, as if, I don't see myself as a chairman. And she said, "Listen, compared to the people who've applied, you'd be God's gift to the department." She was always a blunt person. And she spoke her mind, as that quote indicates. So she simultaneously insulted the people there and insulted me only a little less. But and she also provided very good advice when I made the application. She said, "Now is not the time to be modest." So I had all the publications in economics journals and other things that made me a candidate that could appeal to sort of the mainstream, and there was a radical stream at AU at the time to both sides. And I got the job and stayed there as well. I stayed at American U for 25 years, but
Now, when you took that job, did you also start at the Urban Institute
No,
at the same
no.
time? No, that came
No.
later.
I became the chair of the department. I went from a soft money position at Brandeis to becoming chair of the department and full professor at American University. So it was hard, even though it was very difficult to leave UTSV and your wonderful wife, Judy. It was very difficult to pass up. So we did move back to Washington, and that's where I've basically had my career. Now, interestingly enough, the first indication of my interest in apprenticeship came about while I was still at Brandeis. And studying all these youth programs in the United States, I became somewhat disillusioned with the way we were doing them, because all these programs were what we would call second chance programs for the most disadvantaged.
Mm-hmm.
And for those programs to work, there has to be a step up that they can aspire to. And if the next group is not doing very well either, then you have a problem. And increasingly, the sort of non-college youth and the non-4-year BA group of youth were not doing so well, and they weren't getting into really good careers. And so I began from actually an Israeli grad student, I'm still friendly with. We started talking about the German system. He had been to Germany, and I began taking an interest in that.
What year was this?
This is in the 80s, 85, 86.
Yeah.
And another colleague by the name of Hilliard Pouncey and I actually wrote a manuscript on it, which we didn't end up getting published, but we did publish an influential article in the public interest called "The Compelling Case for Youth Apprenticeship." And so I stayed involved in that world and kept up with it. Came to know some foreign colleagues who were working on it.
When did you two hook up?
Late, like 10
Much
years ago.
more recently, maybe
10 years
8
ago.
years. Yeah.
But
And-
when would you say apprenticeship went from being kind of one of many interests to, your faith, for want of a better
Well,
word?
in the first place, when we did that article in 1990, we were doing it at a time when there was growing interest in this subject. Hillary Clinton was on a commission. There was another commission on the Forgotten Half, and Bill Clinton got interested in it, and actually before he became president, not during the campaign, but before that, not long before that, we shared a platform where he spoke about it and I spoke about it. There was a Progressive Policy Institute group that was for moderate to conservative Democrats. And they were a big backer of Clinton. And they published this piece also. And this organization, Jobs for the Future, was starting a program on youth apprenticeship. I was on their advisory board. So this is now in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. And I remember talking to an OMB guy who I'd gotten to know earlier, and he said he was normally a no person, no new programs, but he said this is a program that might work. This is during the Bush administration, George H.W. Bush administration. Yeah. So George H.W. Bush proposed the National Youth Apprenticeship Act of 1992. And then Bill Clinton liked youth apprenticeship. But unfortunately, as the sausage was being made in creating a bill, they created a bill called School to Work Opportunities Project. And apprenticeship kind of got bypassed, really. There's some noise. I don't know.
Yeah, where is that?
I'm afraid there's a protest outside my house, but they're passing.
Okay.
I think.
Okay. Tamara lives at Capitol Hills.
I could mute. Why don't I mute until I have something to say?
Okay. Anyway.
Well, you know what? I think they are. I think they're truck drivers. So maybe they're protesting vaccines.
Okay. Anyway. So I was very disappointed with how that worked out. And meanwhile, during that time, I was chair of the department at AU, and was not called in much to do anything on it. So I stayed with it, but
well, this would be a good point to talk about your starting the financial economics program.
Right, absolutely. So at AU, because of my friendship with Svi, we devised the idea of having a program, because I'm the chair of the department now, on financial economics for public policy. American U had a big master's program. It was more kind of international oriented. They didn't have a great PhD program, but a lot of people were in this master's program. And both Svi and I thought that there was a niche for people to understand modern finance, which I was only beginning to find out about, in the context of its importance for public policy. And we created that program, still operating at some level. Didn't grow as I had hoped.
No, but you did get recognition. You got some sort of award from the university.
I got an award for building an innovative program at AU, and I have to say that it's partly because of the distinction between business schools and economics departments, because the business school had some people that knew some finance. The economics department did not. Not a lot of them were even interested in it. And we did manage to sort of merge in a way that worked well for the program. We did have an excellence person that we hired, but he left for various reasons. So the program somewhat atrophied a bit.
So let's talk about the think tank world. So now you're just at the point where you're going to come to Urban, and
Yes.
I think let's talk about both you and Urban, but also
Yeah. Well, I got a call.
Well, let me
from
just
Bill.
finish the question. Let me just finish the question. So, but what's emerging at that moment is a much broader sort of think tank movement in DC. We're sort of going from the old public intellectuals like, I don't know who, Irving Kristol, who would, didn't need to belong to a think tank, to intellectuals and scholars and researchers in think tanks. So talk about both your experience and that sort of emerging moment of think tanks.
Well, I think it really started in the late 60s with Urban Institute. And then one of the things that sort of mixed things up with think tanks were policy research shops. And the negative income tax experiments and the supported work experiment, government funding really jumped that field. And that generated an organization, Mathematica Policy Research, Apt Associates, and Manpower Development Research Corporation. All of these, not really think tanks, but more contract, but social policy research contracts. So that was one big development. The think tank world, I think, emerged first from Brookings. Initially, Urban Institute was more of a think tank. And then I'm not sure when the American Enterprise Institute started, and Cato Institute. And so you have now a whole group of them in Washington. I got invited by the president of Urban. They needed a center director at Urban Institute. And I sort of first asked him, well, why would I want to do that? Because I had just gotten a tenured full professorship. I had been on soft money at Brandeis. Why would I want to trade this security and ability to write about whatever I wanted to, although you did have to teach, for a soft money situation? So what I ended up doing was taking leaves and also being at Urban part-time during school year, and ended up doing a lot of projects. One of the biggest projects was actually the Community Healthy Marriage Initiative project, which I led. And at that time, not much money, not any money was going to support research on apprenticeship. So I was writing about it, but not in a way that was funded.
Right, interesting. AEI was funded in 1938, interestingly, pretty earlier than I was.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so here you are. So now we're coming up to the present. I want to come back to your politics because, again, I would not call you a passionate political partisan by any means, or like a man of the left. That's sort of not your vibe. You're a rationalist. And yet you have devoted your life to research and thinking and whatever about improving poor people's lives.
Yeah.
And I mean, doesn't need to be a contradiction there, but it's,
I kind of like to see myself as favoring policies that can appeal to both sides in that context. And I think apprenticeship certainly is one. South Carolina, which is a Republican state, they've pioneered, and their governors have been very supportive. Tommy Thompson, who was a Republican governor of Wisconsin, helped, partly influenced by my article, but helped create the youth apprenticeship program in Wisconsin. So that's one. But even on fatherhood, the belief that fathers should play a bigger role, we should hold them responsible, but we should help them be engaged. So that's something that the two sides would go for.
Yeah.
I've favored.
Call yourself what do you call yourself? When
Yeah,
people say,
confirmed moderate.
Confirmed moderate, a
Yeah,
confirmed
now-
moderate.
Here's what I would categorize Bob as. He is a genuine thought leader and activist ever since the internet. Bob is leading several discussion groups. Talk about them, Bob, because I don't follow all of them that he's got. He's got one on Middle Eastern affairs. He's got one on, you name it, and he's leading discussions on the internet.
Yeah, I lead discussions with people that I know, and I haven't gone to scale. My daughter thinks I ought to start a what's it called? A Snap? No, one of those. One of those
Substack.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have interest in what's going on. It's their interest, including especially Israel. My older daughter lives there. When I was growing up, I wasn't oriented toward Israel at all, unlike Tzvi. It was only, when I actually went, I thought, that's an interesting place. Well, during the '67 war.
Well, by the way, it is true that we became very friendly when you moved to Boston, but we had a connection through Jack Habib.
Right.
Because Jack had been,
and I heard you
practically lived with us for a while before
I heard you give a seminar when you came for a reserve.
That's right. Yeah.
So, but
Bob, keep talking about your connection to Israel. That's really interesting. The evolution of your connection to Israel.
Well, in the '67 war, which occurred during my comprehensives, was tricky. I was like American Jews. I was very worried and so on. And my first trip to Israel was in late '73. It was after the '73 war. There was a group of educators. I, looked at wanting to go there. And that's when I saw Jack there. I decided, well, why not go there? I mean, it was there that I sort of came to see why kibbutzes had difficulty working. I came to Israel believing that everybody in Israel was very clever. They had, how did they outsmart? How did they do so well in the '67 war and even '73? They were surprised. That was bad, but they ended up well. Why? And I would go and I would think, well, there's something here in Israel that's done in what seems to me as an economist, a crazy way. But there must be a reason. There must be a rational reason. And so when I got to Israel and I worked for a think tank there, a new social policy think tank called the Brookdale Institute. More and more, I started realizing, no, these things don't make sense. And I remember vividly being at a party with someone from the Treasury in Israel. The Treasury Department was very strong. It affects all the other departments. And only one party had really ruled Israel from '48 to '77. And so in '75, early '76, I'm at a party and I'm going through all the things that things should be done differently. And why do you subsidize this when what you really want is that? And then because of that, you have to raise taxes on the thing that would really work. And I'm talking to this guy from the Treasury. And at one point he says, well, I guess I'm cooked in the system. And that was that really illustrated the way people thought up until 1977, when Menachem Begin happened to win. Not that he was a liberal economist oriented person, but part of his party was in that direction.
Yeah.
But I was very emotional feeling toward Israel and still do. I was very concerned about some of the periods in Israel when they had hyperinflation, they had other serious economic problems that came out of this being cooked in the system and not really reforming properly. I always felt that it was odd that Israel had these brilliant economists, but they couldn't reform the economic system very well. They were writing for big journals in the States and other places. So I've gone through a lot of evolution on it. I worked with Lenny Hausman, who was also interviewed here, on trying to bring Arabs and Israelis together, and felt that there was, in terms of my views, we felt that there was a natural track now after the Oslo Accords and the ability to, and there were various meetings and so on, until the 2000 Second Intifada, when all hell broke loose. And I became more of a realist, like a lot of Israelis became. And,
so are you I mean, how do you, we're getting toward the end, so but maybe
right.
one more question in Israel, but are you optimistic about how things are going to play out politically in Israel? Not like who's going to be, prime minister, but are they going to find a way to exist in the region?
I always do try to look at half full glasses. I'm by nature, I am far more of an optimist than a pessimist. That said, I try to take into account the real world. But look, I mean, they've formed a government that covers such a wide spectrum, and it's stayed in place.
State of power, yeah.
I'm told
it's the team of rivals, Israeli style.
yes, and I'm told by Jacobib that they put in much more talented director generals of departments. They've added competence to, and it's not a one-man rule. And so that's a positive. I think, personally, I think that all of these groups that try to create huge sympathies for the Palestinians are actually creating more resistance, the ability for them to resist. And it actually is an unintended consequence, perhaps, but it makes them less likely to compromise. And Israel can only compromise on some things. So I think that for now, it's running well. I do worry about the longer term, but I think
he's going to be later this month. He is going to Israel to fix things.
I'll try to patch things up when I'm there, but anyway. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. I think, like, unfortunately, and I'll just maybe close with this set of views. I mean, I think that the anti-Israel sentiment in certain parts of the far left is a piece with a lot of other strange things that have arisen. That have made people who you would think would be rational, made them unhinged. And that's the best way of putting it, because some of them think race relations haven't really improved, when in fact, the feeling for sort of interracial marriage, for example, is one indicator, has improved dramatically. All kinds of other elements have improved dramatically. They're unhinged about the idea of merit, even. And
the one thing that Bob
you don't
and
want to
I
go
haven't,
over a bridge. You don't want to go over a bridge by somebody who didn't have the merit to become a good civil engineer
or have brain surgery. But I mean, it's interesting.
Go ahead.
I think it's really interesting that your sort of closing comment, right? It's sort of about rationality and paying attention to the facts.
And the belief in progress.
But, and I mean, I think that's kind of you in a way, like look at the facts, think about it rationally, believe in, be happy.
I see apprenticeships starting to take hold a bit. We have an opportunity. It might not work, but we have an opportunity. Today, we just had a press release on our new nonprofit called Apprenticeships for America. And we're going to be trying to scale it through advocacy as well as building networks. So I'm still very active and in fact, continuing to work on funded projects to actually create apprenticeships directly, as well as trying to affect policy that can have a much larger indirect effect. And I'll be sticking with that, Svi. Don't worry, I'm not retiring.
Yes, you know, don't retire. That's my rule. And what's more, once this is posted, this interview, every one of your siblings has to watch it.
Okay.
That will boost our viewership quite a bit.
Well, what I didn't say is that the extended family is now about 450.
That's right.
460. Some of them are very young.
All right. They can still watch the video.
If I can get the ones that are 14 and above to watch it, we'll set a record.
Yeah, my younger sister told me today, she's 68 years old. She said she listened to the interview of me and she learned things that she didn't know about the family, you know?
Yeah. Wow. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
What
all
a
right.
pleasure to learn.
That's it.
That was great.
Tamar, you've got to say it along with me. Sei
gesund.
gesund.
sei gesund. Okay. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.